So wait, you're on the Mulsanne doing God knows what speed at 1:30 in the morning. And it's just like, fine.
There's something about French people and big American V8s. They love each other for some reason.
Yeah.
They go crazy over each other.
I've never been to Indy on 500 Day, but I'm told that's as close as you get.
It's very similar, just more French. And British.
The Brits go in scores. The Brits hop on the channel or hop a plane or swim or ride a fish or whatever the hell they have to do.
I think I know of a couple that became a couple at Le Mans too. Probably from not being able to find the right tent. Who knows?
Heyo!
If the race happened and nobody was there, would anybody notice?
So what we're doing this week, this is another one of our, what we call the other three episodes, where we have a bunch of different formats. They cycle in based on what we've got going on that week, what we find interesting. And this one is called, I'm a little uncomfortable with this because I don't like focus on me, but this one's called Sam Rambles About a Thing. And essentially that Ross is a thing that I love, right? Something I dig on, and you're the unlucky victim this time, right?
Oh, sure. I love the things, by the way.
So theoretically, most of these things will be motorsport related. Some of them might be car related. Some of them might be history, then overlap of those two things. But in the end, ultimately, I'm a giant dork for a lot of stuff. And I kind of can't shut up about a lot of stuff, as Ross and our producer Mike have been very patient with and discovered and known and found out over the years. And this one's a special one. This one is, we're going to talk about Le Mans today. We're going to talk about the 24 Hours of Le Mans, aka the greatest endurance race in the world, one of the greatest races and competitions humanity's ever put together, and one of the weirdest, coolest things in history. And you've kind of got the edge of me here, Ross, because I've only been once, but you've been, what is it, 4 million times? 5? When did you start going?
Actually, the first time I went was in 2009, 2008. I actually went to the Le Mans Classic historic race because the team I was going to drive for in the 24-hour race the following year said, let's go over there and drive in this historic race to get a few laps of the track. Because at that time, simulators were not that great. So the best way to learn the track was, let's go over there and run a historic car. So I did that. And yeah, been there. That's when I first went. And yeah.
So wait, so the historics are usually, for those of you who don't know, so Le Mans, we'll get to the basics in a second, but 24 hours, sports cars on a mix of permanent circuit and public roads in France. And it started out as nothing but public roads, but over the years, part of the track has been part of the circuit, the roads had been just kind of converted into a half track that ties into public roads. But so when they set that up, they obviously don't leave those roads closed for long because French people drive on them and need to use them to get places. But they leave them up long enough that other events can happen there. And one of the other events is the Le Mans Classic, which is a vintage race with cars. So this was after, I forget, is it after or before Le Mans every year, the actual running?
It was actually in July. Yes, it was in July. So it's after, I think it's a month afterwards, and it happens every second year, I believe.
Okay.
And the way I had it described to me was the Le Mans Classic historic race makes the Monterey Historics look like an SCCA club race. And I have to tell you, the cars there, the people there, that was mind-boggling for the first time. And then, yeah, that I guess that what it did though was it kind of introduced me to Le Mans in it kind of eased me into it, because when I went back the following year, it was to coach there. Unfortunately, my drive part didn't work out, so I was going there coaching the following year, and I had the full experience of what is Le Mans, and being someone who started following Le Mans, kind of through Road and Track, and because that was about all we had then.
Yeah.
Way back, and I can't say that I was old enough quite to follow the Ford versus Ferrari middle of the 60s stuff, but the tail end of that kind of stuff and into the 70s. And that's when I kind of really started to follow it. So to actually be there was, it was a dream come true for me just to go there and experience it. And yeah, it is special.
So the interesting thing about the race itself, like the actual 24, the Pro 24, the big race is
Yep.
it starts in the afternoon and runs until the afternoon the next day. They run through the night, yada yada yada. The historic, don't they end up, they run it all day, but it's run in groups. So there's like 90-minute runs or something like that, right? So you might start at like, if your group might start at 1 a.m. and finish at 2:30 or something like that. I don't remember.
Yeah. The car that I drove, I think we were on track like 3 times over the course of 24 hours. So, like I said, it's kind of easing you in. And I'd done Daytona and stuff like that. So it was, that part of it was not special. But the funny thing is that
I'm sorry, that was not special. So wait, you're on the Mulsanne doing God knows what speed at 1:30 in the morning. And it's just like, fine. Wait, what were you in? What were you driving?
So the first year I did it, I did the historic twice. The first time I did it in I think it was a 69 Corvette.
Oh, wow.
Like one of those Greenwood monster things.
Yeah, the big things.
Monstrous. And, there's something about French people and big American V8s. They love each other for some reason. Yeah. They go crazy over each other. So that was kind of fun. We were popular from that perspective. And that was, so it was interesting. But we went over there and we went to test and, get ready for this thing. Yeah. And the car kept braking. The very first lap I ever turned at Le Mans was behind the pace car at the start of the race. And because of the fact that we never got any practice laps, I was at the back of our group. And I can't remember, there was 25 cars in this group. So I was starting 25th. And the first time I stood on it at Le Mans was, get down the Mulsanne straight, stand on this, and this thing just rockets down the back straight through the chicanes and stuff. And because they were there at that point. And so my first lap was in the race. I'd never done any practice laps yet.
So a Greenwood style Corvette. So for those of you who don't know, so imagine a late 60s Corvette, and then imagine that the whole car is made out of taffy, and somebody just started at the front, started at the back, and just started pulling, and then at the sides just pulled it. Like they're cartoonish and longer. They have these big shovel noses, and they just got bigger and bigger with every evolution. And underneath all that is big block and some giant transmission and big Corvette stuff, right? So what did it mean? So the Mulsanne is one of those public roads that they convert for. It's nuts. It's a literal 2-lane highway between running to the town of Mulsanne, but it's one of those roads that they convert to the circuit, and it's extremely long. They put 2 chicanes in. I believe it was the 80s, right? They put 2 chicanes in to slow it down, but it's still long. Yeah. So what does a big block Corvette see on the Mulsanne? $180? Like, what were we doing?
I have no idea.
Such a racing driver
that's
answer.
kind of it's one of those questions that, you often go, how fast you go? Sorry, I'm too busy to worry about that.
Right.
So I think that's the best way to look at it is I'm just too busy. But I will say that those cars did not have the best of brakes.
Yeah.
So while the straights are very long, there's a point where you're like, oh, there's a chicane way up there. I better start getting on the brakes now because this is going to take a while to come down for whatever the speed is, which is big. But I'm going to need to start to brake now. So, it was like I said, I was easing my way into Le Mans.
So the cool thing about Le Mans, and this is where I have a hard time shutting up, right? So it starts about a century ago. And it starts as just a durability test. And in the same way that Indy in the 500 started as a durability test, and people were driving the hell out of whatever they brought. But, early endurance races, as Mike knows, everybody knows, weren't sprints. They were, you intentionally drove the car below whatever 10 tenths was, whatever your maximum pace was to conserve it, because otherwise it literally wouldn't last. And even as late as the 60s, things were running out of brakes, things were running out of tire, you could run out of gearbox, and hell, even as late as the 90s and the 2000s. And these days it's turned into far more of a sprint race in so many ways. And that's it, to the point where it's almost cliche to say it. But the really cool thing about it, I've been So how many times have you actually been, Ross? You've coached in
So 1, 2,
several
3,
times, right?
About 8 or 9 times, I guess.
Man,
Yes.
did it? I asked Marshall Pruitt once. I went there once, and I was talking to Marshall about it. And I asked him, I'm like, "You've been a bunch. Did it ever get old?" And he goes, "No." And I went,
No.
"Well, something has to get old." He goes, he thinks for a second. He goes, "The French people get old. The rest of it doesn't get old." Like, did it get old for you?
So first off, the French people never got old for me. I've never had a bad experience in France, and I love that part of it. And hey, being Canadian, I took French in school, but being a Western Canadian, I never spoke a word of French after school, or other than that one hour-long classroom thing. So every year every year I've been to France, and I've been to France for some other things as well beyond Le Mans. And every time I've gone, it's like about the day I'm coming home, 10 days into the trip or something like that, I'm going, oh, I recognize that word. I get that. So anyways, the French part, I love that part of it. If there's anything that gets old for me, it's the sort of getting around. It's and every year you go, it's sometimes I've gone there and I've stayed in a unbelievable, like it's a castle.
Yeah.
And you're staying in that, and it's the best. I remember the best Wi-Fi I ever had in Europe was in this old house that had been built in the 1100s. And you're like, and literally I would look out the window down on a moat around the place. So I've stayed in places like that. I've also stayed in a little hotel room above the railroad station in downtown Le Mans, in which case you don't sleep at all leading up to the race weekend because the trains are going all night long. So I found that's the part that gets a little bit old.
Yeah.
And one other thing, I'm going to say Europeans in general, and I'm going to apologize to anybody here that is a European bathroom fixtures designer.
Oh, well, I mean, that was actually my second career when I started journalism, but it didn't pay as well, oddly.
But the French have not figured out how to have a shower in a bathroom.
Wait, is this the thing where like there's the half door, the glass panel, and then everything gets wet? And God, I remember that. Yeah.
At best, it's a half panel. Like it's like, hey, I'm washing the entire bathroom, all the walls, everything. Yeah. So it's like, wow, anyway. So I can remember getting to a hotel room in Paris, right next to the airport, and it was a Marriott hotel. And I get in there and I go like, oh, look at that shower. Like that was like a major moment after experience. So what gets old is the lack of a nice shower. And but I gotta say the whole experience around the circuit and everything, no, I can't imagine it ever getting old.
It is such an event. So growing up, like I first came to it through books, and my dad had a VHS copy of the Steve McQueen movies. So Steve McQueen, at the height of his fame, decides he wants to make a racing movie. He's into it. He had just done several years before had done On Any Sunday, really interesting movie by, I think it was Bruce Brown, on dirt bike culture and motocross culture in Southern California. And so he goes over there, they shoot the race, they rig up a bunch of camera cars, they put together, it was this long protracted production. And the end result of it was, 2 hours or whatever of amazing on-car footage. They actually ran a car in the race. They ran a GT40 with no roof with film camera on it. And they, the production company entered cars. And you have this wonderful film that has absolutely no plot whatsoever. There might be like 20 minutes of dialogue in the whole thing. And then all you do is sit there, and it's like watching a ski film. It's like, those, that just set like, I don't know, club music to footage of guys helicoptering into the Alps and then going down some kind of like triple double X Black Diamond run for 20 minutes. And it's just ski porn, right? Except it's 917s and Ferraris and Ferrari 512s and 911s and all these other things. And I watched that I wore out my dad's VHS tape. He had a couple of speakers hooked up to the TV, just a little amp. And I remember cranking the thing in our basement and just watching it over and over and over and over again. And you get the sensation of like, yeah, it's this big long race. Yeah, it's sports cars. Yeah, there's a lot of noise. Yeah, it looks like public roads. And then you get there. And the thing is, so I flew into Charles de Gaulle and then sat around the airport for like 6 hours, 7 hours, transatlantic flight, waiting for the next train, went down to the train station, got on the TGV, which is, this wonderful, the whole thing rides like a couch, and you look up at the little speed clock on the wall. It's doing 11 million miles an hour because it's a high-speed train and it's France, and they believe that nothing in life should ever be pain except the things that are painful, and those have to be very painful because they're French. And I remember getting off the train and like walking through that little station at Le Mans, because Le Mans it's a village basically out in the French countryside. And I'm walking through the station, this little stone station, and I walk out. It's very dark inside, and I walk through the front doors out into the little plaza in front of it and just get bathed in sunlight and looking around in this wonderful, glowy, like 65-degree summer day. And there's a food market set up, and somebody was selling fresh eggs and somebody was selling bread, like on the steps of the train station, just for the next 20 feet. And then I walked around and looked for a cab and got a cab to wherever the hell I was staying. And it's all very storybook and idyllic. And you get just smacked with this sense of it's all something. You have arrived for a thing, these little weird French buildings and bright colors. And then the whole week leading up to it, it's this whole production. It's like Indy and the pomp and the circumstance. And they run the drivers through town past the big cathedral in a parade. They all sit on the backs of cars, and everybody fills into town, just endless stacks of crowds. And, you stand there for, I think we sat there, it was with somebody from Car and Driver and another friend who was in town. And we might've stood there for like 3 hours waiting for the thing to start. And I remember thinking, this cannot possibly be worth it. It's just going to be a parade. And I might've eaten a baguette, like an entire baguette, just sat there gnawing on it on a street corner in France. And it rained. And then all of a sudden the parade happened. And it was neat. And it was like this drawn out little fairy tale production. And for some reason, like Jackie Chan was running a car that year. So Jackie Chan was in the back of a Cadillac or something. And there are all these little weird, unexpected things you see. And it just drags out. I mean, it's so, like I said, I went once, and it's probably not as magical the second time you go, but there are so few things we get to do that live up to every ounce of the billing, right? What
I think it's just as magical the second time, the third time, the fourth. For me, at least, like I said, I think it's got to be about 9 times I've been, I guess. And it is just as magical every time for all those things that you've just talked about. And then they're cars.
Yeah.
and I've often said to people that if you are a motorsport fan and you had to pick one event in the world to go to Le Mans. Followed very closely by the Indy 500.
Yeah.
Because from it's a race. Don't get me wrong. There's a race going on, right? But it's a spectacle. But the cool thing about Le Mans is I think you can get closer than at any other motorsport event, closer to the real stuff that happens. You can be on the sidewalk in the parade, and going back to a few years ago, Tom Christensen, the guy that has won Le Mans more than anybody else,
right?
He's coming along, and he's on the back of this car. He's signing autographs. He's hopping off. He's saying, like, you get closer to the drivers. And then before the race, there are spectators on the front straightaway walking around.
Right. And in the pits. Yeah.
Like in the pit lane, bumping into the cars. The crew's kind of like, excuse me, we're just about to start a 24-hour race. Please don't stand on that dive plane. So there is that. So just that whole part of it. And I want your reaction to at the beginning of the race, before the start of the race, they start playing all the national anthems, short little pieces of the national anthem of every driver in the field. And then it gets down to the last two. And they always save the second to last national anthem for the British national anthem. And I have a British friend who often says, Le Mans, that's a British race that we hold in France.
Yeah, because the Brits go in course, like that.
Yes.
So that whole middle area. So think about like if you've never been, think about what it takes. I forget how long the Cirque du Sarthe is. The track itself is, but it's massive enough. It stretches between 3 separate towns, and everything in the quote unquote infield is there's office parks. There's like I don't think there are neighborhoods, but there's entire chunks of like civilization between the
people
racetrack.
live inside the track. Yeah.
And so like you go there and you see all this stuff and you see like massive in all this space is massive fields of campgrounds. And it's segmented by some of it, like you'll walk into one campground, it'll be like obviously all Germans. Like some of them are wearing weird helmets and half drunk and driving around on tiny go-karts and yelling things in German. So they're obviously German, but like many of them show up with flags and tents that are in their country's colors. But most of the campers and most of the people who show up, like statistically, are Brits. The Brits hop on the channel or hop a plane or swim or ride a fish or whatever the hell they have to do, and famously have been there in thousands and thousands and thousands for years because it's just this thing they love and they adore to the point where the guy who is the voice of Radio Le Mans, the main broadcast stream, like one of the most loved motorsport voices in history, and probably the one guy tied to Le Mans more than anybody else, John Hindau, he's British. I mean, it's just like, it's nuts. It's so cool.
Yeah. So these national anthems, cheering going on for, there's that moment when all the German, all the Germans come out of their little pup tents,
right?
And then, the Dutch people all pop out, and then, the Italians all pop out, and then, it gets that British thing, and the crowd, like it's hard to fathom unless you've been there how big the circuit is. But when that British national anthem is played, boom, it goes crazy. And then they play the French national anthem. And it's just, so that whole experience, I'm going to say that was the thing that caught me the first time, was just, and then, they'll have, the French, whatever, the Air Force, fly over, and whether it's helicopters or jets or both or whatever. I mean, there's just all of that stuff. But at that moment in time, there's got to be, it seemed, 10,000 spectators on the front straightaway. And the race is going to start in 20 minutes. And they go, okay, everybody leave now. They leave and they wave everybody off and the cars drive off. Like,
and that front straight is bookended not bookended, but kind of like boxed in by grandstands. And there's the big control building above the paddock, or above the pit garages, because every team has a garage because your shit breaks and you push it in the garage to deal with it. But on each side are just these massive grandstands that rise up, and when the race starts, they're full of people, and you look down the front straight and it is this wall of humanity, and you don't get it. I've never been to a sports car race that felt the same way. Like, I think the closest you might come is, I've never been to Indy on 500 day, but I'm told that's as close as you get, right?
It's very similar, just more French. And British.
Man, so many memories are coming back, right? So the year that I went for RNT, for Road and Track, and I wrote a story, and this came out of one of those pitch meetings where everybody's like, I don't know, what do you got? And we go around the table and everybody's like, well, what if we did this? Or I know this person and this car's coming up. We have access to this, or this would be an interesting profile, yada, yada, yada. Somebody goes, well, this is a dumb stunt. What if we do it? And I was like, I know it's an old trope, but I like, first of all, I like torturing myself and doing dumb things physically. But B, I like experiencing things like as deep as you possibly can into your pores. And the only way to experience a 24-hour race as deep as you can outside of being in it is to stay up for the whole thing. And I was like, what if I go over there and just like wander around, talk to people, and stay up the entire night and never go to sleep and just be real dumb about it and eat a lot of crepes? And I forget who the editor was at the time, but whatever the editor was looked at me and was like, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm, yeah, do it. And I'm like, do you want me to say more? And they're, no, that's fine. Sure, do it. Yeah, fine. Smith, go. And so I had no plan, and I showed up, massively jet lagged. So I had probably slept like 3 hours the night before. And then before that parade, and then the day of the race, it was so jet lagged that all the sleep came at the wrong time. I was up most of the night. I ate like 5 bags of gummy bears and didn't do anything useful with my life. Probably spent a lot of time on Craigslist. And then show up at the race, and they send the race late in the afternoon, and they drop the flag. And the year I was there, it started, I think it was the first time, what was it? So I was there 2016, which was the first year that the Ganassi team won with the factory Ford GTs. And that, I think that was also the first time they had started it under yellow. I'm not sure. It rained massively, right?
Yeah, they started behind the pace car that year.
That was it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Because I was there in 2015 and didn't go back in 16, but because I'd been there in 15, I was like, okay, who do I know and all that kind of stuff. So I was following pretty closely. Yeah. And I remember, that was the year they started behind the pace car because it was raining so hard.
Right.
Yeah.
There was the starter guy, the guy who dropped the flag. Brad Pitt was there to drop the flag, and there was this, like, I was just close enough that I could see the look on his face. I was, like 100 yards away. I thought I could see the look on his face, but he was on the Trinitron. It was on the Trinitron. That shows how old I am. Jumbotron, whatever the big screen was. There was vacuum tubes and cathode rays.
The big screen.
Le big screen.
Yeah.
But he was on the screen, and you could tell, like, Brad Pitt out in the rain with his fancy Brad Pitt hair and his fancy Brad Pitt face, holding a flag, and, like, he's narrated MotoGP documentaries. He likes bikes. He likes race cars. Guy is presumably, by all accounts, decent human, cool to hang out with. He looks so miserable, and the flag dropped, and he was just kind of like, and then they kind of hustled him off screen, and I from that point on, I just thought, well, I'm just going to walk around and do whatever seems most interesting. And the thing you don't, you mentioned it earlier, the thing you don't get out of the place is the scale of it. Like, you can't walk the length of the infield. You just can't. I mean, it's massive. It might as well be a whole county. It's not, but
so you could go, and I want to hear your stories about walking around because I've seen some things out there.
Oh, it gets weird. It gets real weird, Ross.
Yes. Funky. I've seen some things, but you could walk around and you could get to a point in the middle of the circuit and not know there's a race going on.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Like, not even hear it, right?
Yeah.
Like, maybe in the distance get the echo of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you get into those, like the sea of tents where there's like one big area and there's, I don't know, 200-300 little pump tents that all look exactly the same. And that everybody staying in them, they are drunk.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that there's people going back and going, which one's mine?
Drunk is an understatement. They're European drunk. Like, it's a different level of hardcore effed up, right? Like, it's
when I saw two guys on those little motorized scooters, kind of like the Razor scooter, but have the little motor on them, only wearing Speedos, racing each other back and forth, and the crowd going wild and cheering them on. And then one of them going down and tumbling and doing the full road rash thing. And the crowd cheering more for them, and him standing up and, like, blood's gushing out of him, but he's like, yeah, look at me. That drunk.
I mean, it's funny because, like, the French, the sanctioning body behind Le Mans is the ACO, which is Automobile Club de l'Ouest, right? So I probably pronounced it wrong, but it's like the other motorsport sanctioning body that's French that everybody knows, which is the FIA, which runs, all of motorsport in Europe, including Formula One. Excuse me, all of road racing in Europe, including Formula One. I think everything else too. Not sure.
But they run all of motorsport in the universe.
Oh, well, there you go. And yes. I mean, baguettes. But so you look at like, if you know anything about the ACO or the FIA, every ounce of the history of both organizations is a history of, like, pedantry and assholishness and being jerks about things, and then being jerks about being jerks about things, and then people calling them on being jerks about things. And they're like, well, I mean, yes, we're being jerks, but we have the rules and we run things, and also get boned, we're still going to be jerks. And then they keep going. And you look at that and you, like, all the times they've been jerky about rule violations or technicalities, or, some win has been taken away from somebody else for some reason, or the rules are this and that and the other. And that's the most French thing in the world. And yet also, somehow, in the grand clockwork of the universe, the dichotomy there of an entire field full of foreign people coming in and being just massively, supremely, like, booster rocket obnoxiously drunk, that's also French as hell. It's like, there's just some element. You walk around, like, it is a circus, and it has it has a sideshow in it. Like it's over near, it's not near the Porsche curves. It might be near the S's. There's a Ferris wheel. There's like carnival games. There's rides. And you can go there at 3 a.m, ride the Ferris wheel. And the top of the Ferris wheel, it stops, and you look down, and you're like, yeah, it's a couple Ford GTs going on the front straight, and they're like there. And, oh yeah, that guy just, yeah, no, okay, there's an 8. Like you watch the whole thing, and it's all somehow like it just all kind of blends and melds and simultaneously exists within a billion different contradictions. And the thing that struck me about it is that like only the French could have come up with something like this. And also if it existed somewhere else, the French would try to kill it, right? It's just, it's so great.
All those years, I've been there, not all, but I mean, well, all of them, like I make it sound like 50 years, but you know, I've never been able to do the Ferris wheel thing. And it's one of those things that, you know, I'm there. I've never gone, well, like you were going to do a job. My job, I was too busy doing things that I couldn't do it. And, but it is one of those things that I've wanted to do. And it's those kinds of experiences, I think, that makes Le Mans special. And I got to tell you a little story that, you know, you talk about the ACO and the FIA and the way they're doing the rules, and it's, you know, this is the way we do things, and you know, it's there is a lot of that. But I got to tell you, so the drivers meeting, so you go into this massive room, and now you've got all the drivers, and you know, what is there, 55 cars starting the race, and 3 drivers per car. So you've got 170-ish or so drivers. Every driver is accompanied by a team manager and or a coach or a helmet holder or whatever, right? So there's probably 300, at least 300 people in this room. And the race director's going on with their usual, you know, there's the rules on everything. And then they go at the end, they go, and now we want to introduce to you the people who will be looking after you. And at that moment, all the drivers stand up, everybody turns, and 100 turn marshals
really
come walking down through the middle of the thing.
You're
everybody
kidding.
stands and claps for them. And this goes on for like 15 minutes.
You're kidding.
They're filing them because these are the turn workers that are going to stand out on corners for 24 hours and make sure these drivers are safe. And it's
I
like,
had no idea.
How human is that?
No kidding.
That's cool. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of one of those things that the first time it happened, I'm kind of like, whoa, this gives me goosebumps. Like it's pretty cool that they do that.
It's such a, I guess that's the thing, the thread through all of it. Like nobody ends up there. The amount of effort it takes to get there, whether you're on a team, in a car, in a tent, sitting in the stands with a poncho on your head, the amount of effort it takes to get there is so immense that nobody ends up there by accident. And nobody, like, it's also one of those things where like it's entirely, the experience you have is entirely what you make it. And that struck me, God, that struck me 1,000 times. But watching people, like, so I was there, the year I was there were a bunch of other journalists who had been brought in by, I went on R&T's dime. So I bought a, steerage class ticket and rode on the wing of a, some kind of Airbus to get there. And then, the TGV ticket happened to be relatively inexpensive. So we did that, but I was, basically on fast food money the whole time. And I happened to run into a couple of journalists who were there as guests of Ford, because Ford had brought, that was a big deal that they were going back. They hadn't been there in official capacity since the 60s with GT40s. And they had brought a bunch of journalists in, but they also had all the manufacturers, their hospitality suites are prefab buildings that are 2 stories and probably the size. I mean, the Ford one must have been the size of a small Target. I mean, it was massive. Yeah. And you walk into it and it looks like equal parts bar, nightclub, restaurant, and dealer showroom. And the idea that they built it because it's also kind of a 24-hour lounge for everybody who shows up, right? All the VIPs who get in. But the point is, there were a couple of journalists that I hung out with at one point who had spent all their time in the lounge. And they were just like, yeah, okay, it's a race. And I'm like, did you go to the field? Did you walk over to the thing? Like, did you, at one point we got in the middle of the night, I met one of our photographers and we traipsed over to the Mulsanne, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But like through the forest, and like we're standing by the side of the track in an office park, and yada yada yada. It's middle of the night. Corvettes are going by. I just, everything is massively intense. And I looked at him. I'm like, did you do any of that? All the really cool stuff? And they're like, I don't know. I mean, I was here and there's sandwiches. I'm like, fuck the sandwiches. It's the Mulsanne. Like, it's so, the experience is what you make it. And if you take the time to learn a little bit and then just go start asking questions and poke things and walk into the, go say weird things to a German, like it just gets better and better.
So usually by the time the race starts, I'm in full race mode and not able to get out and do that. But one of the years, and I can't remember which year this was, I actually walked out to the turn, Indianapolis turn, which is out in the middle of the forest. I got way out there at night and watched the cars from out there, and to see these headlights coming down in the night, going a billion miles an hour, and then the sound, and they come down there and down through the gears, and they turn in and they go through there, and flame shooting at the back, all that stuff. If you're not a car person, if you're not a racing person, you will be after you go and see that.
It is so, there are so many, it's like, what is it? David Hobbs used to talk about Indy, right? Like how, you go there the month of May, you bang around the place all month, it's empty, and then something shifts when the stands are full of people and you head into turn one the first time under a green flag, and it just narrows up and everything changes. And it's that wallop of everybody collectively being there for something. There is some kind of weird human like density, some weird singularity at the core of it all that gives everything this great big power and makes it seem to matter.
So where did you go that was like, oh, this is like the coolest? And don't tell me it was the Ferris wheel.
Oh, no, I actually, the Ferris wheel, it's funny. It turns out I have a giant undiscovered fear of heights. I got up on the top of it and was like, no, bad news, need to be somewhere else. And it, cause it goes up and it's actually a pretty small Ferris wheel. It's probably not that high. And cause it's French, you sit there and you're like, do the French care about this? Are they anal retentive about this? Or is this one of the things they don't care about? What if it, it's swaying in the wind? It's raining now. Oh yeah, we're stuck up here because it stops. And you get up there and it stops at the top and you're like, cool, race cars. And then I look down and I'm like, no, it's bad. But, yeah, I don't know. We ended up in the midway at, 1 or 2 in the morning, but the absolute best part of it was, so the track is big enough that there are places that just nobody goes, right? That, you can go off in the woods and you will be several hundred yards from another human in a place where they did not expect anybody to want to walk. So there's no crowd control and there's nothing. One of our photographers, who was actually our art director at the time, was a guy named Matt Tierney, lovely dude, later worked with him at Haggerty. But he had never been either. And I found him in the middle of the night. He was like, you want to go find the Mulsanne? I was like, yes, I do. And it's, so again, like massively long straight, the longest racing straights in the world. Like in the 70s, they were doing, 917 would do what, 210, 220 there. And even now with two chicanes to slow the cars, they're still doing close to that, more. I don't remember.
Yeah.
And we walk over there and we start walking and I'm like, this is a long walk. And I had a picture of the track map on my phone. I pulled it up. I'm like, Matt, we can't walk there. He's like, no, we're not walking. And I'm like, well, where are we going? He's like, oh, we're walking to the car. Car's like 15 minutes away. So we walk to his rental car. We get in his rental car and then we drive for like 15 minutes through like roundabout and roundabout. And it's pitch dark. Race has been going on at this point for, 8 hours, whatever it is. And it rained on and off. We're in this rental car and we get over to so it's on the opposite side of the track. And like, if the start finish is, on a clock, if it's like 10 o'clock, I want to say the place we went to on the Mulsanne was, if the track is the clock, that's like 3 or 4 in the, I don't know. Yeah. But so we went over there and we drive by. Like the thing about the Mulsanne is there aren't a lot of spectator spots on it. It's a really long straight. Everybody wants to be at the end, braking for, it's not White House, Mulsanne Corner.
Yep. Yeah.
Everybody wants to be down there or like in the Porsche curves or, there are all these famous spots. So in the Mulsanne, like the truth of a racetrack road course is that, the straights are the least interesting part. but I had never seen the Mulsanne. And like in the McQueen movie,
Yeah.
it's trees.
Yeah.
And so we got there and we drove around a bit. We couldn't really find any place to put the car. And there was this office park, imagine where, imagine where some company that makes paper clips and widgets keeps all of the 400 engineers and the 50 accountants that make the paper clips and widgets, that where they work, like this mirrored 3-story building. There were like 10 of those. And that was roped off. We couldn't park there. And so we kind of parked down the road from it and happened to park in front of a forest and like walked over to the office park. And the track was, you could hear it. It was over on the other side of the trees in the park. And in the back side of the office park, there was a guy in a cherry picker that had a light on it. And he was either a spotter or a flagman. I don't know. But we looked over there and there was a marshal standing at the office park. And there was this bored ass guard. He was like, no. And I speak no French. So I was like, I'm a very apologetic American. We left. We kept walking around. And eventually Matt was just like, you know what? Screw it. And he started walking toward the trees. I'm like, yes, we're walking toward the trees. And then we trudged through the forest and just like, it was muddy and wet and weird. And we finally got to the fence at the side of the track. And it turns out we were maybe 50 yards upstream of that cherry picker. And just before one of the chicanes, it must have been the first one. So I look down the straight and you can hear stuff, and you hear it long before you see it.
Yeah.
And then you hear the Doppler change, and then you see the lights, and the lights are tiny. And then you see the beams on the lights start to shake and change across the trees. And again, this is a public road. It is a 2-lane road that they slap some Armco on. And all of a sudden, like, you know what's happening at a sports car race when your spleen cavitates and your shoes vibrate, and you hear something that sounds like deep thundering America blasted into your earballs, and that's a Corvette. And then the Pratt & Miller Corvettes, factory Corvettes, just went by in quick succession, and it was like they just my whole brain just compressed and then came loose again. And I looked at Matt and I'm like, and it was this deafening moment. I don't know if I've ever been that close to something going that fast in the wild. Like I've stood trackside at Indy qualifying and had like Indy cars track out, a foot from my face, on the other side of the fence in places spectators can't go. But that's a racetrack, and Le Mans is a racetrack, but it's also not, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We stood there for maybe 20, 30 minutes, and I couldn't get enough of it. And it was so dark. Then all of a sudden it wasn't. And there was just this big washing wave of car, and it just kept coming and coming and coming. It felt so improbable and ridiculous. It was nuts.
This year at Le Mans, I met some friends on the Friday, I guess it was, parade day in downtown Le Mans, sat at a little cafe like you do in France.
Yeah.
And talking to them. And I, knew these are friends that I've met through various car club stuff at tracks around the US. And, we're talking and they talked about the same kind of stuff. Like they'd been before, I think. And that's the kind of stuff that, the fact that you can go exploring at a track,
right,
is it's just different. And just that whole experience. And, I know people who have met people at Le Mans and become lifelong friends. And I think I know of a couple that became a couple at Le Mans too, probably from not being able to find the right tent. Who knows? But yeah. So I it is so different from, you go to Mid Ohio. Okay. You're in this little thing, I can go there. I can go there. That's it. I can go to Indy. Well, even that, like Indy is, and don't get me wrong. Like I love Indy. I mean, it's something that, for me, the Indy 500 and Le Mans were the two things as a kid that mattered.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all that mattered in my kid life. And so they're both special, and I'm probably biased because of that. But from a spectacle and from an event perspective, and then the fact that, like you said, all of a sudden, boom, there's a car there. Like I don't see anything. Whoa, now I see something. And just the speed of that. And I'll tell you, drivers find Le Mans like on one hand, they'll go, it's not that difficult because you have a lot of time between corners. But that's the problem. It's you almost have too much time in a couple places. Now, when race drivers talk about that, that's all relative, right? They're used to, 1.2 seconds between corners, and now they've got 3.5 seconds between corners. So that's like a lot of time for them to think about stuff. And so that whole thing in terms of the staying focused, being able to keep track of other traffic around them, all of that stuff. And then there are some massively high commitment corners. The Porsche curves are, on paper, they don't look that difficult. Okay, they twist around a little bit. But the level of grip and the speed through there in any class of car it intimidates every driver. I'm going to say it's as intimidating as turn 1 is at Indy for somebody that's never been on an oval before. It's tough.
It's hard to process even when you're there, just how fast a lap is, right? And so one of the neat things about Le Mans since the beginning is that they've run prototypes alongside, initially it was lightly modified road cars, and now, that kind of amounts to basically low-end professional sports car racing stuff. But it's still, it's so big, and the speed disparity in traffic is so massive, and the top line prototypes, the stuff that's vying for an overall win carries so much speed. I looked it up this morning because I couldn't remember the lap record until 2017. Apparently the lap record held from 85 to 2017. There was a point where it was older than most of the drivers on the grid, and then it became older than all of the drivers on the grid. But the lap record back in 85, and keep in mind the track was slightly different, but it was Hans Stuck in a Porsche 962, and it was an average of 156 miles an hour over the lap. He averaged 156, and that only broke in, what was it? Yeah, I've got it here, 2017. It was Kobayashi in a Toyota, and he bumped it up to like by a tenth of a mile an hour, went from 156.4 to 156.5, right? But that's massive. Like, that's insane.
And there are 2 corners on the track.
Yeah. There's
2 corners on the track that are first gear corners.
Yeah.
And a couple of those that are second gear corners.
Right. And you couple that with the fact that they run it in the rain, they run it in, or not just in the rain, they run it in whatever weather they get, right? And there are stories of guys not being able to see enough, even with, oleophobic screens and massive wipers and yada, 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 not being able to see well enough in the rain or at night because the headlights aren't good enough, and just literally having to count the distance in seconds between corners and having to drive it by feel and by 1, 2, 3, all right, turn in for here. Yeah. And doing that in that traffic in something that, again, averages like that. I mean, it's absurd. And what's it like to drive? Like you actually have seat time on it. Does it feel big when you're on it?
Yes. I'm kind of like, well, Sam, you've been there. It's big.
But I mean, you know that there's some places that shrink. Like Road America is a big place in a Miata, and it's a lot smaller in something that has real power. But this is bigger than that by a massive factor. Where do you get a sense of the scale?
So the weird thing is that I have many laps at the Nürburgring as well.
Yeah.
To me, the Nürburgring does not feel bigger than Le Mans. And yet it's almost the Nürburgring, the Nordschleife is like almost twice the length.
Yeah.
But you're so busy. And again, I don't want Le Mans sounding like, oh, it's boring. But there are places where there's these gaps between corners, and it's that timing piece that I think the best drivers rely on, whether they can see or whether they don't see. There's that rhythm that you get. That's like, come out of this corner, you make these shifts. Like, okay, now I'm gonna brake, boom, 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 boom. I turn, and it's harder when the rhythm, like, if the beats are happening all the time,
right,
it's a whole lot easier. But if there's bigger gaps between them, it's harder to kind of keep that rhythm going. So I think that's why it feels strange. The other part of it is that you get so few laps.
Yeah.
You go there, and drivers go there for the first time, and it's like, great, the first session's 2 hours long. I'm going to get some serious seat time here. Okay, you just got 5 laps because you shared it with 2 other drivers, and
Right.
you just don't you don't get a lot of repetition. And I think that's the toughest part of Le Mans is most drivers, I think they leave the race and go, oh, okay, now I got it.
It was, there's, we could do this for literal hours, but so many, God, I could yap for more hours on this. So many things popped up when I was thinking about this morning before we sit down to tape this. The fact that at like 3 or 4 in the morning, everybody's quiet and the stands are empty and you can still walk around and the cars are going. And then there's a crepe stand that opens up behind the main straight in front of the grandstands, and they'll sell you a Nutella crepe and you walk around eating a crepe. And then if you want a beer, there's beer. And then there's all these other traditional racetrack things. And yet in the background is this giant circus happening, and everybody there is fighting something. The line is something like, you don't get to choose whether or not you win Le Mans, it's whether the race lets you win, because things happen outside your control. People prep for months and show up. I show up with, just as, Ford's hospitality suite is 2 stories tall, like all the driver hospitality areas and the media hospitality areas behind the grandstands for every manufacturer. Porsche has one, Orica has one, like they're all there. They're huge. They're these little 2-story buildings. And the year we were there, Porsche was still running the 919, the hybrid prototypes. And we walked in and they were gunning for the overall win. And I met one of the PR guys there, and he's like, oh, you want to see the garages? And we walked to the garages, and the garages are tiny. They're like a bus station bathroom with really low, small ceilings. Like you could barely park a Camry in one of these places. And they're running, some of the fastest cars in the world out of them. I'm like, okay, cool. He's like, well, do you want to see the back of it? I'm like, what's in the back? And he's like, well, that's where we keep all the spares. And you walk back, and there are containers and containers of spares, and there's a spares room. And we walked in the spares room, and I looked around. I'm like, oh, wow, that's like, a billion wheels. And there's like 3 or 4 drivetrains sitting on the ground. And there's a bunch of batteries, and there's some other things, and this, that, and the other. And as we were walking out, I'm like, what was the other thing in the back? It looked like a spare car. And the PR guy looked at me and goes, that's not a spare car. And I went, but it looked an awful lot like a bunch of bodywork in the shape of a car. He's like, that's not a spare car. You didn't see a spare car. You saw parts. Yeah. And I'm like, but it looked like, he's like, those were parts. And he got very serious because you're not allowed to bring a spare car. And I was like, so I'm not going to ask about the parts again. But you look at all that, and then you realize that, like, I mean, one year, what was it? When Audi and Porsche were both running, they famously spent, what was it, like, it was like $250 million each. Which means Volkswagen Group spent $500 million to fight itself, to just go in a room and punch itself in the mirror. And Audi and Porsche were going at each other. And you think about all that, and then you think about the fact that, like, all of that investment and time and everything else could be wiped out on a first lap crash, could be wiped out when so-and-so puts your car in the fence 5 laps in because he's stupid, or because some other car did something stupid in traffic, and it all goes away. And it hit me. It's like, anything else that we really care about that's got great big tradition behind it, none of it could be planned. If you sat it down and tried to invent it, you couldn't, and it wouldn't mean anything. Part of it's the momentum, and part of it's just, it's like anything we care about, whether it's Wrigley Field or the Empire State Building, stuff that we see big meaning in, we always kind of arrive at it almost by accident. And it's just so magical, and the details always matter, right?
And I'm going to say that, I'll state the obvious, that racing it's the highs and the lows.
Yeah.
The sport can be cruel. I went the last 2 years coaching a driver, not this year, but last year. In 2022, my driver in a LMP2 car in a Pro-Am class, where at Le Mans, the amateur driver, the AM, matters, like, makes a big difference. You cannot, if the AM goes down a lap, it's not like an IMSA race where, we'll get a pace car and we'll get a wave around and we'll be back on the lead lap again. No, the AM's got to do their job. And my driver, that was 3.5 years after he just started racing.
I'm sorry, what? Wait,
3.5 years.
Was this Steven?
Yes.
Oh man.
And at the end of the race, I stood in pit lane with 100,000 other people, standing up and looking at that massive Le Mans podium and seeing him standing in the center position because he won. Well, he and his teammates won. And that was magical. And then this year we go there and car spins in front of him in practice. He crashes. They rebuild the car, not a spare car, but a rebuild with parts. And then the race starts, and I don't know, a couple hours into the race, the non-AMs, not Steven, but a pro, incredible. Something happens and turns sideways on the Mulsanne straight, writes the car off. We're done. So it's cruel. And I think the year that you were there, wasn't that the year when Toyota's like broke down on the last lap or something?
Yeah, they were leading by a long shot. And it was one of those things where, so Toyota and Porsche were in contention, fighting for the lead. And then something, I forget what happened, but the gap widened. The delta got massive. It might have been like as much as a lap or two. And the thing about Le Mans is that anything can happen, right? And they were leading, and I forget what the exact details were. I should have it here, but I was in the media center, which is right over the paddock, and conveniently has little bowls of Haribo gummy bears that they keep stacked all night. Go in there at like 3 and 4 in the morning, neat little bears. But you go in there, and it's interesting too, because nobody really showers if they stay there. Most of the journalists leave and come back, but they don't sleep. So it's this like festering hive of scum and villainy and like really, really bad haircuts. And everybody sits there and gets stinkier and stinkier. But I'm sitting in this stinky, poorly ventilated room full of gummy bears and really, really unpleasant people, because that's what we all are, journalists. And watching the end of the race, and Toyota came by, and then this lap that it didn't. And Heimdall was on the radio trying to figure out what happened, and it slowly trickled in that like they'd run a nearly perfect race. Everything had gone well, and the stuff that hadn't gone well in the spare car, they'd managed to fix, and they were doing okay. And then I forget what it was. It was like a piece of turbo plumbing came loose, or a connector, and boom, they were done. And they had been trying to win the thing like everybody else for years and years and years and years. And Porsche, like at that point, the Porsche team, I was across the stands, and then had been down in the garage again. They had these boxes of, it's like the Super Bowl. They print T-shirts saying Porsche wins Le Mans. If Porsche doesn't win Le Mans that year, they quietly put the T-shirts away and then burn them somewhere, or have some weird German ritual of sadness, because the Germans are structured for everything. But Porsche had started packing up. The whole factory team had been packing up. And they had just assumed they were hosed. And then the Toyota stopped, and I think it was on the front straight even. I don't remember. And the Porsche people were like, wait, what? And they got the T-shirt boxes out again. And everybody was shocked that it actually happened. And it's this, I don't know, there are all these little moments that you don't expect. I sat in the grandstands and watched the sun come up. And they're like, the grandstands at like 4 a.m, there's nobody there. You look across the whole stretch, like 200 yards of stands, and there might be like 3 people sleeping in ponchos. And then you sit there and you watch the sun come up. And, the night before you saw it, it started to get dark. Like all these private jets would take off from the airfield behind, head back to England or wherever the hell. And in the morning, they started landing again. So that the dawn's breaking. It's this golden morning, and I've got my little crepe, and I'm bleary-eyed and don't know, up from down, wearing my shoes on my ears. Like nothing about me is normal human. And it was this wonderful wash of just high, just this full body, just second wind, wonderful high. And you can't make that. You can't stew that in a lab. You can't build that. I cannot imagine what it's like to have things go well. Man.
So I think one of the things I take away from what you're saying is, like, if the race happened and nobody was there, would anybody notice?
I mean,
I was there in 2021.
I was just going to ask, you were there in the pandemic when nobody was there.
When there was no spectators, and it was, it's like, yeah, it was like you kind of kept walking around going, when's somebody going to jump out from behind that wall there or something and scare me. Like it was just, and I talked to people who had been going to Le Mans, working at Le Mans for, decades. And they were like, this is wrong. This is just not right. And, that whole year of 2021, there were a lot of races that we all went to when, as working in the sport, you went to them,
Right.
but there were no spectators there.
Yeah.
And there was a little bit of us, kind of like, oh, this is kind of nice because, we can kind of walk and go anywhere we want. And, but there's no traffic. There's no, trying to walk through the paddock just before the start of a race sometimes can be a hassle, just trying to get through the crowd. And this was, it was wonderful, but I learned pretty quickly that that's not good.
It's funny. It gets you, and that's probably a note to wrap on, right? Like so many other things that matter. They matter because we collectively decide they matter, and we collectively decide to celebrate them, like Indy or the World Series or the Olympics. Any of these things where the meaning we apply to them is half the draw. And if that whole vibrating chunk of the human species as an organism as a whole isn't involved in it, is it really? I mean, it was Le Mans. It was the 24 hours. It was 24-hour sports car race. It's been going on for a century. But was it the same thing? And it wasn't, because the people, the drunk Germans, the Kreps, the fields full of Brits, like the supercars with tents slung off the back of them, parked in a muddy field, all of it. I cannot get enough of things that we cannot put our finger on why they matter, because it's this weird little tie into the universal stuff that makes any of us love anything. Like you're just drawn to it, right? I think that's probably as good a note to end on as any, right?
Yeah. If anybody's listening to this and they've sort of thought, I'd like to go to Le Mans one day, go.
Yeah.
Because you're going to make the difference. Yeah. Because it's the people there and what happens. So
don't make a plan. Camp, go, sleep, get drunk, eat too much, fall over, get really, really weirded out at the top of a Ferris wheel, whatever it takes. But it's one more of those things that you don't really think is a big deal until you experience it. And if you're not into it, you can't be there and not get something out of it. But I don't know. Thanks, Ross. This was fun. I appreciate it.
Another good thing.
And that brings close to the first edition of Sam Rambles, where Sam, in fact, did ramble too much. But thanks for listening.